In this section of the course, we're going to look at some of the more practical iPhone-specific editing tips and tricks. This section also serves as a roundup of some of the most important concepts discussed in this course. The first tip is to use Photos and Lightroom together. The process that I would personally recommend is to do your geometry and possibly cropping correction in Photos, import your image into Lightroom, do the rest of your editing here, export back to Photos, and then share from Photos. Don't forget about the other third-party apps that we mentioned at the beginning of this course. These apps have quite exceptional filters and can be used as a great starting point before taking your image into Lightroom. Just be aware that after you export your image with a filter from one of these apps, the filter is now compressed onto your image file and actually changes the information that is editable beyond that point. For any advanced editing tools like selective adjustments or retouching, Snapseed is a great free option in the App Store. Using multiple softwares is definitely not ideal and can complicate the editing process, but it's a great way to experiment and get some unique edits on your photos. As long as you understand the editing process, you should be able to pick up any photo editing software and see what's best for your needs. It might be a good idea to start with learning Photos. Learn all of the tools within Photos until you're comfortable enough with it to where editing feels pretty intuitive, pretty natural, pretty comfortable for you. Once you get to that point, then you can go into Lightroom and start to explore some of the more advanced ways you can use these tools. There's a lot of crossover between the terms that Photos and Lightroom uses for their tools, so by having that base knowledge of Photos, learning how to use Lightroom will have a much easier learning curve for you. The brightness of your phone's screen is a big consideration when editing. You should always make sure that your screen is set at an adequate brightness when editing, and ideally you shouldn't edit in any conditions that make seeing your screen difficult, like in broad daylight. If you edit on a dark screen, your image will likely be edited too bright since you are overcompensating with your exposure. If you edit on too bright of a screen in perhaps a dark room, your edit can appear too dark. The ideal situation is 80 to 90% screen brightness, but this largely depends on your device and the environment. One of the more common issues that I've heard people describe to me that comes down to brightness is when they've tried to print their photos and they come out looking dark. This is simply because paper is not backlit and can only reach a maximum brightness that is much lower than a backlit screen. If you want to print an image, consider editing your photo at about 60 to 70% screen brightness. This will give you a more accurate rendition of how that image is going to print, depending on the paper that you print. Ultimately, be aware of your screen brightness when editing and know that it's playing an important role in how you're perceiving your image. We've talked about non-destructive editing many times throughout this course now, so I'll keep this short and sweet. It's best practice to edit on copies of your photos so that you can always go back to your original version and re-edit it. This is handled differently in Photos and Lightroom, but both softwares by default work in a non-destructive manner. Once you export an image, all of your edits are compressed onto that file and can no longer be accessed. It's good practice to adjust the white balance of every photo you edit. It's very common for auto white balance systems to render images too warm or cold or introduce a noticeable green or magenta tint. Reflective surfaces with strong color can actually cast color onto the elements in your image. If an image has a dominating color like this one, which has dominating red and green elements, the auto white balance can overcompensate and end up tinting the image. In Lightroom, this process is even easier. From the color section, I can select the eyedropper tool, hover over the neutral area, tap the check mark, and my image is automatically corrected. White balance is a good place to start your edit since it provides you with a neutral base. At the very least, you should execute your white balance corrections before doing any other color corrections or color grading. I've already mentioned this quite a few times as well, but presets and filters are another great place to start your edit. This can especially help if you're not sure where to take an image or you're new to editing. Presets and filters can show you some edit styles that you may not have thought about or simply don't know how to achieve. In the best of circumstances, you can have a full edit complete with just the tap of a button. Generally, you'll get the best results out of using filters or presets when you dial back the intensity and apply it a little more subtly. Cropping is one of the most effective ways to take an image from okay to great. Cropping is an opportunity to recompose your image. When cropping, you should consider compositional guides like the rule of thirds. Most cropping tools will actually overlay a 3x3 grid that helps you with this principle. This guide states that by placing dominating elements on one of these third lines, including the horizon of your image, will create a more pleasing composition. You can also consider using different aspect ratios and experimenting with vertical or horizontal orientation. As a rule of thumb, you can let the shape of your subject determine the best orientation or aspect ratio. Tall, skinny subjects might be better suited for a 9:16 aspect ratio, whereas wide subjects might better suit a 3:2 aspect ratio. When cropping, the main consideration should be focusing your audience's attention on your subject and removing any distracting elements. Scanning the edge of your frame for elements that are peeking in but not providing enough information to the image is a great practice. Lastly, you'll commonly want to straighten the horizon in your image. Keep in mind that when cropping with an iPhone, you only have so much room to crop into your image. If you're shooting with a 12 megapixel JPEG format, you're going to lose resolution quite quickly. When shooting with Apple Pro RAW, you have about 4 times more pixels to use to crop in. When you rely on natural daylight for your photos, it can be a bummer when you get an overcast day and everything just appears kind of gray. If you've taken an image that looks dull, no need to fear. Increasing the contrast of your image can quickly make your subjects stand out in your image. Just be careful not to overdo it. Overcast light can only look so contrasty before it starts to look unnatural. This trick also works the other way around. If you took an image in broad daylight, sometimes decreasing the contrast can actually bring in more detail into your images. This actually leads into the next tip, which is to recover highlights and shadows. This goes back to the lesson on dynamic range processes, which can introduce more detail across the vast spectrum of light in your images. Lifting the shadows and pulling down the highlights can achieve a higher dynamic range in your image. With raw images, you'll be able to control this to a greater extent. Typically, once highlights are overexposed in JPEG images, they're not recoverable. Think about the color in your images. Good color is usually a matter of personal taste, but you'll be on the right track if you can start to think about color cohesion and color contrast when looking at your images. Ask yourself if the colors are over or undersaturated. Getting the skin tones right in your subjects is another huge consideration. This relies on your knowledge of the appearance of the person's skin tone in real life. White balance and exposure can also help in rendering an accurate skin tone. Beyond this, you can use something like the color mix tool in Lightroom to accurately edit the hue, saturation, and luminance until it appears accurate. Color editing is usually better suited to a less is more approach, but it can also be used to create a stylistic or surreal look. Many filters will experiment with these more stylistic color edits. Developing a process for editing your photos is key to removing the barriers that editing often imposes. If you grow to be comfortable with your own editing process, you will feel more in control and inclined to actually edit your photos. Consider the organization of your images so that it makes sense to you and isn't cluttering your iPhone. Working with albums is a great way to organize photos. Consider how you're going to select the best photos from a session. In my opinion, Lightroom has the best functionality for this with its rate and review tool. You can start to develop a process where you use different softwares for different editing processes or tools. Also consider where you're going to save and export your photos when they're finished. How are you going to share them or back them up? Experimentation is an important role in any creative practice. Don't be afraid to experiment with these different softwares and tools. In fact, this is going to help you learn how to properly use them very quickly. If you work on a copy of your original image, then you can rest easy knowing that no matter what you do to the image, you will always have the original to go back to. This should hopefully free up any worry that you might have that you're going to mess up the image. The last tip that I have for you isn't actually an editing tip at all, and that's to get everything right in camera. Often, this is just an ideal to strive for, but if you can consider your exposure, color, and crop before you take your photo, you'll be able to produce much better images. The potential of editing is very much limited by the captured photograph. Quite possibly the most important element to get right in camera, especially if you're working with JPEG images, is exposure. I've mentioned this time and time again in this course, but that's because it really is so crucial. With digital cameras, you generally want to expose for the highlights because once those details are gone, they're gone for good. This also goes for your crop. If you don't pay attention to your crop, you may end up cutting out important details that you quite simply can't get back. It's also important to consider while you're shooting if you want to crop your images to a certain aspect ratio in editing, or if you know that you'll be doing any kind of geometry correction. If either of these are the case, then you may want to shoot a bit wider than your intended composition so that you have room to crop in, straighten, or correct the perspective of your image without losing important details. That concludes this section on editing tips and tricks. As we near the end of this course, I hope that you're feeling more comfortable with the editing process, and I hope that some of these principles are starting to soak in. If I sounded repetitive during this section, then that's probably a good sign that you've been paying attention. In the next section, I'll wrap up everything that we've gone over so far in this course, and I'll leave you with some words of encouragement to start your editing journey.